Great. Well, welcome everyone. I'm very happy that everyone was able to make it. I know there was a little bit of difficulty with the scheduling, but glad we're all here. So pursuant to Act 54 of the 2023 legislative session, I, Patrick Titterton, on behalf of the Joint Fiscal Office, would like to call this first meeting to order. The first order of business is to elect a chair from among the legislative members of this committee. Are there any nominations?
I'd like to nominate Senator Clarkson.
A nomination. Is there a second?
Elizabeth behind you is waving her hand. She's very kind. I can see her right above your shoulder.
So with that, are there any other nominations? If not, all those in favor of Senator Clarkson chairing this committee, please say aye.
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 All those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. And with that, I will hand this meeting over to the chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for all of us who are here, and Saoirse and Patrick and Emily for doing all the work to get us launched, which is so much appreciated. Let's begin. Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored to do this. Both Elizabeth and I, Elizabeth represented this bill and subsequent act on the floor of the House, and I represented it on the floor of the Senate. And so we are sort of have been deeply engaged in this work, but not as much as some of us around the table. So I'm Allison Clarkson. I am a senator representing the Windsor County District. I serve as vice chair of Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs, serve on government operations, and I am the majority leader in the Senate.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Sharp. I'm the Director of Community Economic Development and Food Security at Capstone Community Action. I spent the last 9 years working at Capstone, working with low and moderate income Vermonters. Specifically, a lot of my work has been around financial counseling, and I'm an accredited financial counselor.
My name is Ellen Kaler. I'm the executive director at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. And back in 1996, along with now Auditor Doug Hoffer, before when he was just a policy analyst, we launched the Vermont Job Gap Study, which was the originator of the Basic Needs Budget and Livable Wage methodology in 1996.
I'm Ashley Bartley. I serve as representative for Fairfax in Georgia, and I sit on the General and Housing Committee in the House.
I'm Rich Wesselman. I'm the senator from Lemoyne.
I'm Sean Sheehan. I work for the Agency of Human Services. Worked Joint Fiscal Office a couple years ago in the Tax Structure Commission, so excited to be back working with Saoirse and all of you. Good to be here.
And what department do you work in?
I work in the central office.
Like the superintendent.
I worked in DEVA for many years, so I understand the DEVA side a lot better. I also
worked with DCF and ESD on a lot of collaborative pieces, but I usually have to phone a friend when I get detailed questions on that side. I will on the DEVA side too.
On a regular basis. Elizabeth and then Aaron.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Burrows, Representative Elizabeth Burrows. I represent Windsor 1, which is Heartland, West Windsor, and Windsor. And I really wish that I was in the room with you guys, but unfortunately have tested positive for COVID this morning. So on my way up there. So I'm in my car instead.
As having
but I'm
just
glad to be serving on.
Well, it's great to have you. And Aaron Larkin.
Yep. Good morning. I am the Director of Government Affairs for the Vermont SHRM State Council.
Great. Terrific. Well, welcome everybody. We thought today would be a good setting the table day to get us, Richie and I have years of long time experience with the basic needs budget, but not everybody does. Ashley's a relatively new legislator. Elizabeth has been working with the basic needs budget. And as I said, both of us represented this work on the floor. So we are understanding some of our hopes and dreams for our task force. And I think today we have been allotted 5 meetings, and it makes some sense today to set the table that with the historic context, what the objectives were in the late 90s when you and Doug and others had the vision for creating the basic needs budget, looking at where it is, how it's used now, the time demands in creating the basic needs budget, and how it's used and how we can update and improve it and make it the really invaluable tool it was envisioned, I think, to be. So I think that what would be great is if we have an agenda which sort of is accomplishing that. We also have with us Damien, Patrick, and Emily, and Sorcia. Thank you all for being here, our fabulous legislative council and joint fiscal office. So in thinking of this, setting the table, I think we couldn't have a better person on our team and representing the history of it than Ellen. So Ellen, would you be kind enough to launch us with sort of the initial vision and purpose of the basic needs budget?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for being on this technical advisory committee and for keeping this very important methodology and report going all these years. If you could pull up my slides, that'd be great. So what I've been asked to do is just provide a very short historical overview of this process of creating the basic needs budget and livable wages. As I said, it was actually 28 years ago. My mom happened to be at a conference in Minnesota, and they had just released what was called the Minnesota Job Gap Study, and she sent it to me and said, "You might be interested in this." And sure enough, I was, and I had known Doug for a number of years already, and asked Doug if he would be willing to work with me on this project, and we raised some funding to be able to pay him to get us underway. So if you go to the next slide. That's all right.
Out of presenter mode here.
That's all right.
The tech whiz is coming to help.
So the funding for this originally came from the Vermont Community Foundation and a few USDA Rural Development when Robbie Harold was the state director, really going back quite a ways here in the memory banks. So the reason, the historical context of what was going on in 1995, 1996, you may recall Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House and Bill Clinton was the president.
Is it possible, Sorcia, to make this full screen?
She's working on it. She's working on it.
Right.
And so back in the day, the economy was very strong, and there was a move in Congress and with President Clinton to change some of the work requirements for people who were receiving TANF. And so it seemed like the perfect time to raise the question, well, what does it actually cost to live in Vermont so that if you are working full time, paying your taxes, earning a living, can you actually pay your bills and not be on public assistance? And at that time, there was no methodology that was widely circulating. It was not an issue on a lot of people's radar screens. And so we thought, well, it would be really interesting to take a look to see, well, what does it actually cost to live in Vermont so that we could understand what would wages need to be to cover your basic needs budget, a very conservative family budget, and then be able to also pay your taxes so that you would no longer qualify for public assistance, because the national debate was, how do we move people from welfare into work? So we wanted to understand that. And so we launched the Vermont Job Gap Study, which turned out to be, thank you, a multi-phased project that Doug was the principal author of and researcher on throughout a time that I was at this Peace and Justice Center up until 2002. And then he continued the work a little bit beyond that. So
You have all this fancy automation, I'm sorry, I'm trying to
That's-
figure out, are we still on this slide?
Yes, thank you.
That's Eleanor. I think Eleanor, I think fancy automation.
So again, and this is an important point. We're probably between Doug and Tom and I will be hitting this over and over again. This is about what does it cost to live in Vermont without public assistance, right? And the intention was to provide guidance to employers because oftentimes, and Erin probably knows this from her work with SHRM, a lot of small businesses do not have HR directors. And so oftentimes, wages are set by a small employer calling up their friend who's a small employer and saying, what do you pay for this position? What do you pay for that position? Well, if all of the employers are paying below what it costs to live in Vermont, then how is that then pay being set at that because that's what so-and-so, my friend down the road is paying is not really a good marker. Now, that's not to say that there aren't plenty of really good HR directors who actually do wage and compensation surveys. There are a lot of good employers out there who do pay livable wages. We know that. And honestly, in all of the years that we've been talking about this issue, I rarely come across an employer who will say, I don't believe in paying livable wages. Almost universally, people are like, no, this makes sense. If you're working full time, you should be able to pay your bills. The question always falls down to, well, what is that wage? How profitable are businesses and can they afford to pay that wage? And do they even know what it is? So this report is meant to be a guidance document. That was originally who we set it for, and it was also to try to inform what the minimum wage was going to be. Because unlike the minimum wage, the livable wage, especially if it's by family size, can't be mandated, right? So the only legislative tool legislators have really is the minimum wage. And at that time, the minimum wage was shockingly low. It's still the federal minimum wage is still at $7.25 an hour. So we wanted to basically understand this, especially for larger family sizes where you started to have kids in the mix. So we wanted to also look for ways that we could actually assist small businesses in learning about how to set fair compensation, to think about their benefits packages, and to think about how to become more profitable so that they could feel like they could afford to pay higher wages. And there are some business owners that will say that if you're not paying a livable wage, then you're in essence being subsidized by taxpayers because your employees are qualifying for public benefits, which are being paid for by our tax dollars. So these are the larger questions that I think we're all going to be grappling with over the next of these 5 meetings and thinking about how do we update this methodology. So go to the next slide, please. So as I said, we during my tenure at the Peace and Justice Center, we published 7 phases. There actually were a total of, I think, 10 all told that Doug worked on. So you can go to the next one. Actually, stay there for a minute. Can you go back? Sorry. So besides looking at the basic needs budget and livable wage, which was the first phase, we also then looked at how many people do not earn a livable wage, and that was what was in phase 2. And then Doug did some analysis to understand, well, what would be the income gap? If you have X number of people that are making less than a livable wage, how much would it really cost to get all of those workers to a livable wage? And what might that mean for the state?
May I just ask you a question as you go along? What was, how many people in 1997 did not
remember? I don't remember. I'll look that up because I brought it.
I just am curious.
Yes, I don't remember off the top of my head. Memory fades. So then in 1998, we published those first 3 all as just informational documents. There were no recommendations. Then in 1998, here at the State House, in the well of the State House, we brought in some folks from Maine who were also starting to think about this. And we had a day-long session where we came up with policy. And we had the well of the State House, I think we probably had at least 100 people that were here across business, across nonprofits, across government. And we came up with a set of recommendations that came out in 98. And then we were doing updates beyond that. The outlier exception that was also really really seminal work that Doug did was the leaky bucket in 2001, which was an analysis of Vermont's dependence on imports. That was when the first idea of how much we're spending on food and energy and wood products from away, and dollars are leaking out of the state when we could actually be producing more here at home. So that's the nature of the work that we started. So go ahead to the next slide. And if you spent any time with the current document that the Joint Fiscal Office produces so well every 2 years, you will see that the basic layout of the budgets and the way the budgets are constructed is about the same. Hit the next thing one more time. So in 1996, the individual single person household livable wage was $8.21 an hour, and that was at a time when the minimum wage in Vermont was $5.25. Senator Susan Bartlett, who was then the chair of Senate Economic Development, got very excited about this and asked the Joint Fiscal Office to evaluate, is this methodology anything? Is this just total crap? And they came back and said, no, this is worth paying attention to. And so that's when, so that then led to the next, what will be on the next slide, but it also then led to 2 50-cent increases in the minimum wage that came directly out of this. So what happened was we were asking for an increase in the minimum wage, but also to have the legislature and the state government pay attention to this notion of a basic needs budget livable wage. And so Senator Bartlett put in the budget for this summer study to happen. Joint Fiscal Office did a request for proposals. Tom Cavett put in a proposal to Joint Fiscal to do the work and included Deb Brighton, Doug Hoffer, and Elaine McCrate as the principal researchers together.
The team.
And they had a legislative body that had, I think it was all legislators, both House and Senate. And the idea was to take a look at a lot of what we had done before, but also to go farther. So it would actually, go to the next slide. It was the first time that I know of that the whole notion of benefit cliffs was brought forward. And this is something that I took yesterday off of the latest tax structure commission report, which Deb Brighton did. And Sean, you probably will know this graph well. These graphs were in 1999 was the first time that Deb Brighton really started to put these together so that we could really understand at what point do people lose their public benefits and what wages are they earning? Because one of the big things that we were hearing all the time from a number of employers, and we were talking, Bill Schubart was the chair of the Vermont Business Roundtable at that time. And so we were engaged with them in these conversations and with the Lake Champlain Chamber because a lot of their employers were saying, well, I really want to pay more, but I offer more hours or more pay to my workers, and they say no. Mm-hmm. And it's because of the benefits cliff issue that we wanted to really understand at what point do people lose more in benefits for every slight increase in their pay? And is there anything from a public policy perspective that could be done to adjust that? And so this has been a perennial conversation in the legislature since that time. There's been many updates to this, the latest one being in 2001. We go to the next slide. 2001. That was done in 2001. So in the Tax Structure Commission report, the first recommendation is to undertake a tax incidence analysis in order to eliminate the tax burden and benefits. That if you're earning more in wages but losing a greater amount of benefits, that's something that we really should be taking a look at. We had contemplated when the first draft of the bill that became Act 54, back in January, we were contemplating adding in an update to the benefit cliffs, but that work had basically just been done. And it was deemed too much to do in this year's summer study. So we're not going to talk about it, but know that the work has been, that there is fairly recent work that has been done on it. I think it's something for us to have in the room with us because it does relate to the methodology and ultimately what we're trying to understand. What are wage levels of what it costs to live in Vermont? If we get this right with the updates, it's going to be helpful then to others who use this, the report, to consider other types of public policy. So go ahead and go to the next one. So quick history of Joint Fiscal Office's history. So after 1999 summer study happened, the legislature, in essence, adopted the process and basically took ownership of the basic needs budget and livable wage calculations. And the Joint Fiscal Office was asked in statute to do the report, in this case, every year, which was done up until 2006. And then starting in 2008, it was every other year. And one of the other things that happened in the statute that set all this up was that to create a technical advisory committee that could be assembled every once in a while to take a look at the methodology and to consider whether any changes were needed. So you all have been brought together. This is not going to be a policy conversation. This is really about the data and it's about the methodology. And we're to work together to really dig into some of the data choices that are, the family sizes, a whole series of things that we'll hear from Joint Fiscal and from Ledge Council that we could be looking at.
However, I just have to put a pin into it. All data does have some policy implications.
Absolutely.
So I would say that there will be policy conversation just inevitably because some of that will come out of the work in reviewing and updating the methodology.
Fair enough, yeah. So that was the last time that there was a formal technical advisory committee created back in 2008. So there were some minor updates. If they were minor enough, Joint Fiscal was authorized to make some changes. So for instance, when the Affordable Care Act happened, obviously there was a big need to adjust the methodology on the healthcare line item, for instance. But then when Dan Dickerson was starting in 2001, and then again in this report that just came out in January, basically said, hey, it's time to convene this technical advisory committee again, because there are significant enough changes. It's been long enough that it's time to get the band back together, so to speak. And so the bill that passed, and Damien's going to walk through it, then authorize us to come together. And that's what we will be doing to basically get ready for the 2025 report. So next slide. I can't remember if there's anything more. So just one quick example of how this does impact policy and the actual work in state government. It is used by private sector folks as well as a guidance document. But in the case of this one example, the Vermont training program, as part of their eligibility, which is actually laid out in statute, employee compensation, the training program dollars can only be used to provide training for those employees whose compensation at the completion of the training must equal or exceed the livable wage as defined by the Joint Fiscal Office. So there are these ways in which having a well-considered basic needs budget, livable wage calculations in this report can impact the execution of programs within state government, as well as being a guidance document for the private sector. So go ahead to the next one. And the Vermont Business of Social Responsibility was part of these, very interested in these conversations. Starting in 2000, they published the Livable Jobs Toolkit. And again, it was aimed for employers to learn about all the different ways that you could improve wages and benefits. They updated it in 2006.
Who published this?
Vermont Business of Social Responsibility. Pat Heffernan actually used this as her PhD thesis, was to create this. Go ahead to the next one. And so why is this important for us to do? It hasn't had a comprehensive review since 2008, as I mentioned. There's lots of new legislators and new leadership who are really new to this and don't know the history and don't know what it could be used for from a public policy perspective. How can it be used to inform policy discussions among policy committees? Those are questions that hopefully will start to happen in January when our report gets published. I'd like to suggest that we are sort of teeing up some questions for the policy committees to consider about how do we actually use this document. There's a lot that goes into it, takes a lot of time and effort. We think it should be used. What does that look like? And then the question is, how might that then also impact the conversations going forward about benefit cliffs? Again, that's not connected to the budget, but it is part of the consideration of public benefits. And what does it really cost to live in Vermont? So I think that may be the last slide.
That's the last one.
Yes. So there you go.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I remember those conversations in '08. And then so there are at least 6 committees, if not more, in the State House that use this on a regular basis. And I think one of our jobs is to find out actually if we're all using it and how we're using it. And so we can have some of those conversations. Anyway, I think that is, I spoke to one former chair from the House who said she never used it. And it just stunned me. So I think that we're going to chat further about it. But I think this is, can be an incredibly useful document. So Damien, are there any questions for Ellen? Feel free to.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
What you just said. I think for me, part of the issue is how it gets used and whether we're successful in using it. And it would be interesting to see, particularly the people moving off and reach up to into a world where they're not getting benefits.
Right.
How we've done since 96 and whether or not people are really better off or not in that chain. We've done a terrible job of keeping up benefits for the reach-up population itself.
Who could get us that from 96 forward, that information?
I don't know whether.
It'll be interesting for us to, we can chat about that.
I think it would be interesting because
Yeah, I do too.
speak to the success of producing the number and how that works and whether we've been successful at that.
Exactly. Good question. Anything else before we pivot to Damien? Okay, you're up. Any questions from the screen? From the Zoom participants? Before we move on to Damien? Elizabeth, Aaron, Tom, anybody?
Questions at present?
Okay, great. The voices from beyond. Okay, Damien, it's yours.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Damian Leonard from the Office of Legislative Counsel. It's good to see everybody and to meet some new folks this morning. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to start us with the underlying statute and the bill, and then I'll make way for much more interesting witnesses for you. So,
Oh, there's nobody more interesting than you. You're fabulous.
flatter.
Sell yourself shorts.
So, okay. So starting with the statute, I just wanted to introduce you to it. It's 2 VSA 526. It's in the Joint Fiscal Office chapter of the legislative title. There are a couple of key definitions to keep in mind while we're moving forward, at least from a statutory standpoint. And you'll see also why it's important to at least be aware of this statute when we get to the committee's charge, because part of that charge is analyzing whether the statute needs to be updated.
Right.
So the first is basic needs. We've defined those as the essentials needed to run a household, including food, housing, transportation, childcare, utilities, health and dental care, taxes, rental and life insurance, personal expenses, and savings. The basic needs budget is the amount of money needed by a Vermont household to maintain a basic standard of living, calculated using current state and federal data for the cost of basic needs. And then the livable wage, and this term gets thrown around a lot in our conversations here in the State House, but I'm not sure that it always relates to the livable wage as it's defined in this report. And that is the hourly wage required for a full-time worker to pay 1/2 of the basic needs budget for a 2-person household that has no children and has employer-assisted health insurance. And then that's averaged across urban and rural areas. So one of the issues that comes up often when we talk about this is that the cost of living is different if you're in Burlington or if you're up in Canaan in the Northeast Kingdom, or you're in another part of the state, Southern Vermont, et cetera. So that's one of the conversations that comes up. And this is really just an average wage for that 2-person, no children, and employer-sponsored health insurance.
Which is a big assumption in and of itself, that they have employers. Yeah.
And that's part of the conversation that you'll need to have, because this was last updated several years back. Let's see.
Yeah, when was the last time we touched the statute as opposed to the?
It was redesignated in 2019 as, but the actual last major update was in 2007. That kind of gives you a sense of how the statute may be a little bit dated at this point. I hadn't graduated from law school yet. In fact, I was in my first year of law school when this was last updated, so.
And Damien, I think that the 2007 update was actually to authorize Joint Fiscal Office to do it every other year.
Yes.
It didn't actually look at the methodology at that point, because we didn't do the TAC until 2008.
That's good context to have.
Yeah.
So as Ellen mentioned, every other year, the first year of each biennium, by January 15th, the Joint Fiscal Office reports on the calculated basic needs budget for various representative household configurations and the calculated livable wage for the previous year. And the methodology is built on the methodology described in that 1999 report that we just heard about, modified as appropriate by any statutory changes by the General Assembly or subsequent modifications adopted by the Joint Fiscal Committee. So the Joint Fiscal Committee often has adopted minor modifications to the formula over the years. And then subsection D provides the authority for the JFC to adopt those modifications based on public policy changes, new data, and other factors that may impact aspects of the methodology. That said, the committee hasn't, to my knowledge, had an opportunity to do a full look at the methodology. Instead, that's happened through one of these advisory committees every decade, and now decade and a half since the last one.
Yeah. I always forget that JFC is one of the committees that, of course, looks at it. How often has JFC modified it without legislative work leading up to it?
I couldn't answer that question for you. For Emily, do either of you know? Yeah, Dan Dickerson probably would have known the last time that had been modified, but unfortunately he's not with us.
But we can still ask him.
But we can find out. It's been a few years since anything was modified. And the modifications have generally been fairly mild. So just to bring you over to the basic needs budget from the most recent one, and this is on the committee's webpage. The household configurations that are currently looked at are single person, single parent with one child, single parent with two children, two adults with no children, and two wage earners, two adults with two children and only one wage earner, and then two adults with two children and two wage earners. So those are our 6 household configurations. One of the things that this committee is charged with, and we'll get to this in a moment, is looking at whether those household configurations are still applicable and whether it makes sense to change them. So that brings us to Act 54, which created this technical advisory committee to update the methodology used for the basic needs budget. I'll skip over the membership because you know who you are.
Now that we've been introduced, we wanted to meet Richie for years.
I look in the mirror every morning and go,
So the committee's charged with preparing a report and submitting it on or before November 1 of this year. So you have a very tight time schedule at this point. And then you're required to submit it to the Joint Fiscal Committee, the House General Committee, and the Senate Economic Development Committee with your findings and recommendations for revisions to the methodology and also potentially recommendations for legislative action if you believe the statute needs updating. In preparing the report, you're tasked with studying the current methodology for calculating the basic needs budget and determining what constitutes a livable wage, potential changes to that methodology, including the identification of not more than 7 household configurations that would be utilized. So that's not more. The discussion in the committees this past legislature was typically, or this past legislative session, was typically focused on, do we need to look at 6 household configurations, or could we look at less? Are some of them duplicative, such as 2 adults, no children, and single adult? Or are there serious differences there, or perhaps should we be looking at different things? And there have been bills introduced over the years that have sought to redefine what basic needs budget or the livable wage is. So various members have thought that different things, particularly around healthcare, has often been one of the factors need to be changed. So again, that's going to be part of what you look at. And that methodology question is, what are we actually defining this as? And then the last piece is potential changes to the statute to account for public policy changes, new data, and other factors that have had an impact on any aspects of the basic needs budget calculation or the cost of Vermonters of basic needs. And then you're tasked with taking testimony from subject matter experts to assist with data analysis and methodology considerations, and also from a variety of stakeholders, including employees, employers, and organizations that represent those groups. You have the administrative and technical assistance of your Joint Fiscal Office, the technical assistance of the Department of Labor's Economic and Labor Market Information Division, headed up by Matt Barowitz, and legal assistance from the Office of Legislative Counsel if you need to draft legislative language or you have questions about the law. And then we're already meeting. You actually do remain in existence until January 30th of this year, just in case you run past that November 1st deadline. There was also discussion during the legislative session of a second report from this committee. And so the committees did want, one of the committees of jurisdiction did not include that report, but did want to give the legislature the option of extending this task force or advisory committee for a longer period of time to do more work. So just flagging that for those of you who may not have been part of those discussions, that there is that possibility, although in all likelihood, the legislature will not pass a bill by January 30th, and they would just create a new committee.
Right. So, yeah, and I think some of that is the hopes that a technical advisory committee will not be disbanded permanently, that we'll keep, because we haven't had one for so long, right? We haven't had any a technical advisory committee advising the legislature.
And so there were additional questions that that various members of the committees that considered Act 54 brought up and proposed having the technical advisory committee pursue.
Right.
Ultimately, though, the bill was whittled down to something that focused on the basic needs budget and not those other policy considerations, which could be discussed in the coming session. So you do have that delayed extended time period for the existence of the advisory committee, but your report's due November 1st. So in all likelihood, your work will be done hopefully sometime around late fall, sometime in stick season.
Yeah, right.
So, and the last piece to note from this bill is that in preparing the basic needs budget for the upcoming legislative biennium to start in 2025, the Joint Fiscal Office is directed to utilize the methodology and configuration, household configurations recommended by this committee because of concerns that the Joint Fiscal Committee will not have time to update and adopt those changes to the methodology. Because if you remember, this is an advisory committee and the authority still lies with the Joint Fiscal Committee or the General Assembly to update the methodology. So
hopefully it relies on the General Assembly to make the changes.
Well, the General Assembly has charged Joint Fiscal Committee with doing that in the absence of legislative action.
In the absence of it, but hopefully we have the opportunity to.
Right, but just in case there is this fail-safe here so that at least the 2025 basic needs budget would use the updated methodology. And that gives time for legislative action or Joint Fiscal Committee action. So are there any questions? Okay.
It was a very straightforward piece of legislation.
It was.
Actually.
All right, great. Well, thank you for your time. I will.
Thank you. It's great to know that you'll be part of the team looking at this.
I will. And I'll be listening in remotely for the rest of the morning from my office. So if you have questions, I can come right back down or I can just join you.
You can answer from right there.
I can.
The incredible addition of our remote access here.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damien. Okay. Patrick and Emily, are you ready to join us?
Yes.
Good. Emily, are you joining also? Are you just?
That's happens.
Pat's I'm Pat. Almost everything.
So again, Patrick Titterton, Joint Fiscal Office. Emily was actually just over there in the corner when the question came up looking at old JFC agendas and found that the last time this was before JFC for a methodology change was in November of 2018. And it was related to healthcare, which it looked like at the time, no one was actually the person who testified on that, which is great. Because when we do talk about healthcare, we're planning on having Nolan come in and explain that methodology to all of you. But for right now.
Well, and it's just quite honestly a flag. I think healthcare is one of the methodology areas that is a concern because it does take into, at the moment, the methodology does take into consideration your income. And there are a couple of them that, anyway, we'll chat about it as we go through.
Yeah, certainly. Healthcare, as it currently stands, and you saw it in statute when Damien was just sharing that, it's, in statute, the assumption that we are charged to use is that they're getting their health insurance plan through an employer.
Right. And that's an assumption that I think needs a review. A lot of the assumptions.
So my plan for right now is we're really going to sort of talk about where we are right now. We're going to talk about basic assumptions, how this has evolved in the very recent past, updating from the 2020 report to the 2022. And the goal here is to get us all grounding in just what the framework that we built for this coming out of what is written in statute and sort of practice that originated in that 1999 report.
Which I probably have one of the only copies, hard copies of.
Oh, surely our Joint Fiscal Office's extensive
When I met
library
Catherine back over a year ago, she had never claimed she'd never seen the whole thing.
Really?
So, I don't know.
So we do have a digital copy available on our website, but as far as I know, Ellen might be right that that's a physical copy.
Thank God.
So I am just going to share my screen so we can look at some slides. slides together. Okay. So, Damien covered some of this, but I really want to just revisit it briefly because, really all of what we do is sort of built out of what is written in statute. It's the stuff we have to do, right? So we're going to again look at two of those definitions that Damon just showed us. We're going to spend some time looking at some basic assumptions that are used. Damien has touched on these briefly also, but I think there are a couple other that we'll look at that you may want to talk about. And I do want to invite you as you have questions, just interrupt me. We don't need to save it for the end. We'll look at what the numbers are from the most recent report update, just how they changed from that 2-year window when it was last updated. And then we'll look at just how the report itself is structured. That'll be kind of maybe the most boring slide. And then we'll talk about some of the considerations that came out of that report and in turn led to this committee being formed. And actually also Joyce will be coming later today and she will be expounding on some of those points.
Yes, because I would just love to put a pinpoint in this. We don't often have the joint fiscal office request legislation. And they were very clear about asking for the need for this update and this work. So it is, that's really in many ways where this began. So yeah, they're pretty invested in our work on this.
Well, we did see that the last time a committee like this was convened in was 2008. And, this is a project that does require resources of our office. So it's good to make sure that the statute is keeping up with reality. So that, is helpful in having you all with us here today for 4 other meetings. All right, so we just saw these, but I, again, just want to touch on them. You see under basic needs, there is a explicit definition of that. It's what do you need, just the essentials for running a household. There are several components here which are laid out in statute that we have to include. And we'll look later, there are a couple of other components that are not required by statute that we do include. Some of those would have been through, I presume, JFC approvals for methodology change. And then, in building up what people need to afford these basic essentials, that's where we put all those components together and get to this basic needs budget, right? I think we're all on the same page with that. So it's pretty broad in terms of what data sources we are allowed to use. Generally, if we want to change a data source, that is when JFC approval would likely come up. Like I said, it's broad, just state and federal data sources. As we go through, probably in the next meeting, we'll really start to dig into the exact methodology for a lot of the components that we do. And we'll actually be sharing with you all of those data sources. So it might be death by 1,000 cuts in that sense. I mentioned, so on the left here, these are the statutorily required components. But there are 2 clothing and household expenses and telecommunications, including internet, which, they're not in statute, but you would think to yourself, yeah, you kind of need those, right? Those are sort of basic living necessities in today's world. So from all that, basically the assumption is you're working a full-time job, 2,080 hours a year. What is that basic needs budget, including your tax burden? What does that all come out to in terms of what you need to be earning as an hourly rate? So in here, you'll see a somewhat important assumption that we are required to use, in that it is the average between what we're calculating for the urban rate and what we're calculating for the rural rate. We'll see later, the urban rate is higher and the rural rate is lower. So when we average those two, if you're living in an urban area, in the state, that's basically Burlington. What what is being published as the singular livable wage is going to be a little bit lower than what we're calculating for your specific circumstance. And then the converse is true if you're living in a rural area. The other key assumption that's built into the statute is that this is a two-person household with no children, and we're assuming they are sort of evenly cost sharing. You know, they're both contributing at a 50-50 rate.
Right.
And it's a one-bedroom apartment rental,
That's right. And you'll see,
so they're coupled
yeah,
in essence.
and
There are no one bedroom apartment rentals.
Uh-huh.
Not that are available.
And not that we're building.
And we need to build more of them, as we have identified.
I'm just,
Right, so hence this definition, something for us to consider. Is this the right is this the right definition for what is a livable wage?
certainly.
Well, and just, I would point out that in the report we got in January, I believe the livable wage, this averaged amount was $15.33 an hour, which equates to only $31,000 plus a year for an individual. And that, I mean, that is really challenging.
can I just, where in this does it calculate if an employer offers retirement or offers healthcare to the employees versus someone that doesn't?
Well, and I think that's one of those are some of the assumptions I think we have to discuss, because we only assume in the basic needs budget that they do healthcare and not other benefits. Other benefits are not considered.
5% savings is in there.
5% savings, and that could be for anything.
I mean, I think it's the point well taken, which is why actually, when this report was worked on in 1999, they called it livable income as opposed to livable wage, because there was this notion that there are benefits that employers provide that have an economic value. The thing that I think is important for us to keep in mind is right now, you can't eat your retirement savings, right? So if we're really trying to understand what does it cost to live right now, what is that wage level? And we're saying the reason why we build into that a 5% savings is because we recognize that that's an important thing for everybody to be able to do, is to save for their retirement. Interestingly, Senator Westman, Doug is asked in his private world to calculate the livable wage for the city of Burlington still, and for Ben and Jerry's. And that is because they have a benefits package, and you might want to ask him when he testifies next meeting about how he can adjust for the notion of a livable income based on that. But it's still important to recognize that there's certain just line items in the budgets that are just really critical because you have expenses today.
So, and I think that's one of the things we need to discuss is, should we weigh any benefits that are offered, because that's revenue, and should we just purely be looking at cost and not consider how those costs are paid for? But should we look purely at what it costs to live? And then there are obviously ways that people meet those costs, but that maybe shouldn't be considered as we look at what it costs to live in Vermont. And there are some assumptions, healthcare being one of them. There are other assumptions that are built into this calculation at the moment, which aren't pure cost. They're adjusted cost. So pure cost of what it costs healthcare is a tough figure to get to, but this one is slightly padded because it's assuming an employer is paying for some of it, and the obviously employees paying for some of it. Anyway, these are the kinds of things I think we're going to be discussing. It's why it's going to be a little more robust than we thought.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, healthcare could certainly be something that you look at in this instance. You know, if you don't want to have that assumption that employers are providing a healthcare plan, you know, there's always the option of looking at, okay, if this person was going to go out into the private market instead, you know, how would that affect what they need to be earning in order to afford that private market plan? And I'll just back up here just very briefly. I mean, you can look at this list and you'll notice that this is not everything that you spend your money on, right? There are other things that are not included here, like if there is any assumption of that the individual has debt, student loan payments, car payments, that kind of thing. So, as you're thinking about all of this, these are questions that we can, continue to look at and consider whether, they rise to the level of something we would consider to be a basic essential need, and whether that is in congruence of what is the purpose, what is the point of having these figures published.
Yeah, education, that's not gonna, clothing, I mean, clothing is a basic life thing.
I would just say, I don't want to do something and put a number out there that discourages an employer from offering retirement and healthcare.
Understood.
I just don't want to put a number out there that it, is a discouragement to them.
Right. I would hope,
All right, so we're going to start to talk about what some of those basic assumptions are. And this is something Damon just pulled up in the actual report. These are the 6 household configurations that we currently calculate. I went back and looked at all of the previous reports, and these 6 configurations have been used since the dawn of time. Since the inception. So again, I know that I wasn't present for it, but I know there was some discussion this past session about, are some of these duplicative? Are there some situations that we are not including here that, we should be looking at, right? A couple of things I want to point out. In these households where there are 2 adults, sort of the basic underlying assumption is that they are either, cohabitating, so it's a spouse or partner that they're living with. So, for the housing assumption for a 2-person household with no children, it's a 1-bedroom. And it's, you get into the multiple bedrooms for those household configurations that have multiple kids. Now, if you were to think about, 2 25-year-olds, they're just out of school, they're probably not getting a place on their own, they have roommates, they're not going to be staying in the same bedroom. So I just say that as sort of a nugget to chew on. When you're thinking about other household configurations we might want to look at. And there's some here that we, again, may think are duplicative.
right, we assume a lot in some of these.
Yeah.
If you're 25-year-old and you're in my town, you can't find a 1-bedroom, you have to live with other people because there's physically not that space available.
Right.
Yeah, certainly.
I think that's a really important point that, and it's probably something that'll come up at our second meeting, is what are the current demographics of our different household configurations? And should we adjust the assumptions for the households in this methodology to reflect what's going on? These were the ones that were most relevant back in
And what people want.
Right. So I think, and maybe that's even something we ask for today, is to have joint fiscal do that to bring to the next meeting so that we can actually look at those demographics and then make some choices, because it will then inform. This is really the starting point, right? It then informs the choices we make on all the other data sets.
Yeah, I think that would be great. So when we have our committee discussion at the end, let's identify, I've obviously taken that note, but let's identify what we want for our next meeting. Definitely, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, and what may be of interest, and I know, probably Ellen or Doug can talk to this, is when these assumptions were first being built, so food and housing was brought up earlier. For a single person, the initial conversation was about, okay, this is basic needs. What are the bare minimum they need? Well, let's just are we going to put them in a studio? Are there studios available in the state instead of,
Is anything available in the state right now is the challenge.
It's true. So that instead of approaching it from a pure efficiency standpoint, there were some alterations made at that time to sort of boost them up one notch. So instead for food, we get data from the USDA and make some regional adjustments to it to be more specific to Vermont. But the basic plan that they have is, I think the term is called thrifty, which is really, I guess it'd be kind of a subsistence diet.
31,000 a year, it's thrifty.
Yeah.
So is that what your internal, how you refer to this one, that this category is a thrifty group?
That's how USDA.
That's how USDA does, okay.
So they refer to it.
Just for the food budget, just for the food.
Just for the
Yes.
budget, yeah. And at that time, when the decision was made, okay, what level do we want to be looking at? They actually, that's another instance where they bumped it up to moderate. Right.
Legislature did in 1999, so. And just to be clear, the reason why these numbers are actually so conservative, the data choices were made that are so conservative, is because at the time, as I showed on my slides, the minimum wage was $5.25 to $6.25 an hour. So the fact that the livable wage was coming out in the $8.50 range at the time politically was like, that's a big jump. Right. So we wanted to be able to say, look, we actually chose the most conservative numbers possible because we want you to really understand what it really costs to live and that the wages in the state are just too low. Employers are paying too little. And so if we had come out with a livable wage number that was a more robust basic needs budget in the, say, $12 an hour range, this report would never have gone anywhere.
So that's, I think, one of the tensions that I think historically has one of the challenges with this budget is that it hasn't always really reflected true costs. I think JFO and there were efforts made to make it more palatable. And I think we need to be able to really look at what real costs are as opposed to what will be palatable for the legislature.
Right, but let's just be really clear that this is all coming from data. So it is real numbers. But it's about the choices for different levels. So for instance, as we'll get into here, the food budget, for instance, USDA has different levels. They call it thrifty, they call it moderate, they call it, I don't remember what is it? Liberal. So you can choose within data sets what you feel is more realistic, more true to your area, but it's still official data. It still comes from someplace, right? So those are the kinds of choices that we as a committee are going to be asked to take a look at and decide, what's the gut check? When we would go around and do workshops on the basic needs budget, that was one of the things that we did in the workshops was to say, take a look at these different line items. What do you pay for food? What do you pay for housing? What do you pay for childcare? And just get a gut check. Does this feel about right or not based on your own experiences? And in most cases, when we would do a workshop on this, people came in way higher than this.
Oh, yeah.
Way higher.
It would be a great exercise for all of us on this committee to do a look at our own budgets in each one of these areas so that you can have, as we go into this conversation, a notion of what you're spending and what we're looking at other people. Yeah.
And the children, there was an assumption that they were 4 and 6 and a boy and a girl. Was there a reason for that?
We can skip ahead. We're gonna have to go back.
Oh, okay.
We'll skip to this slide for now.
Representative Burrows has her hand raised. You can't see.
Oh, we can't see it. Sorry, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, go for it.
Thank you. I was wondering whether would it ever be appropriate to include inflation in these considerations?
So we do incorporate inflation, and one thing we'll touch on a little bit later on is when we're comparing how this budget has changed from the last report, is some of those inflationary pressures which did lead to our published livable wage increasing. So there are, inflation is kind of a fundamental component of all of this, because we are looking at sort of nominally, what are people having to, pull out of their wallet and spend on, gasoline or food. So, as the price of eggs goes up, I know that was a sort of famous example during the pandemic. As the price of eggs goes up, what they have to spend, from their budget has to go up as well. So inflation sort of is implicitly built into the calculations that way.
Well, and every.
Yeah, I sort of wonder what, I mean, I know this whole thing is about inflation, but but there's a difference between inflation and cost, even if it is intangible. Like the cost of housing, for example.
Sure.
The actual cost of housing versus the inflated cost of housing.
Yeah, and so, I mean, yeah, we're talking sort of real appreciation and nominal appreciation here. The way that we pull the data together is going to, it sort of represents real current, well, in most cases, real surveyed current day costs. So implicit in that would include, sort of real appreciation and nominal appreciation, which I think is kind of what you're getting at.
Yep, that's just what I'm getting at. Thank you.
So I guess the simple answer is yes. But coming back to your question from earlier, these are the basic assumptions, and I went and looked. These first popped up in the 2006 report, where they were sort of explicitly laid out that these are the assumptions for who is in these households. So if it's a single household, we're assuming it's a woman between the ages of 20 and 50. I went and looked at some of the data sources that we use for this, and the age range looks to be kind of connected to how a lot of agencies report their data. They kind of lump that cohort in together.
But to go to Liz's point, that is not, this is not reflecting a household with two 18-year-old boys or one 18-year-old and 16-year-old boy. The food situation is entirely different.
Yeah, and it's sort of a dynamic relationship that we'll end up seeing. The instance of a couple of teenage boys. Childcare costs for those children will be lower, but to your point, food costs will be higher. So there is some sort of interplay there.
Allison, this is Doug Hoffer. Can I interrupt for a minute?
Yes.
Just a quick thought. The original question was about the choice of two children at 4 and 6.
Yeah.
The reason for that was that one would be preschool and have different childcare needs than the 6-year-old.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you,
and
Doug.
as to Representative Burrow's question, inflation is not just implicitly included, it is explicitly included. For example, the transportation cost is based on a mileage thing, which we can talk about some other time, times the IRS mileage rate, which changes every year and reflects the increased costs of owning and operating, maintaining a car. And that's true for everything throughout the entire budget. All
Thanks,
these numbers have changed every year. I'm sorry to interrupt, Pat.
You're not interrupting. That's helpful. Thank you. And the transportation is miles traveled.
Yeah,
is that an assumption of average miles traveled?
What happens is there's something called the National Household Transportation Survey, and they do it nationally. The sample size for Vermont is modest. A number of years ago, we asked for, not us, but somebody in state government, probably AOT, asked for and received permission to expand the Vermont sample, but it still wasn't great. But either way, it tells you how many miles you can expect a family of 2, 3, 4, and so forth with different circumstances to drive in a year. And obviously that's going to be very different than somebody that lives in Manhattan. So it is based on the rural environment, but as Pat pointed out in a recent conversation, we consider alternatives. But I mention that only because the transportation piece weighs heavily on the IRS gasoline, the estimated cost of maintaining and owning a car, which changes every single year,
right?
Including gas.
Some of us every week. Right. Okay. Pat, why don't you keep going?
I just had one
Oh, sorry.
question. That's okay.
I know that in this report, it doesn't include, like public assistance, and it will say like this family based on this income isn't eligible for EITC, for example. So it doesn't, but does it include the child tax credit as a boost? Because that could be with 2 kids, like an extra $2 an hour. If you're, does it calculate that or not? Is that just an extra bonus?
So
it is, okay.
We'll look at that a little bit later on. We're actually gonna look at what I think Ellen is showing right now, which is how we break down everything and stitch together to get to that final number.
Okay.
So we'll actually go to the report and look at that specifically.
But it goes to another concern if you're looking at true cost and not at revenue offsets. So, you know, if we're going to look at what it really costs and not take into consideration other, offsets to that family, with that configuration, you know, I think that's one of our discussions is do you take into consideration those other pieces?
So
tax benefits, subsidies, child support, healthcare support, you know, or do we look at true cost?
So specifically, the child dependent care credit and the child tax credit are included. These families all are falling in the income ranges that are eligible for those tax credits. To the question of child support, the assumption that we do use in this report is that the single parent is not receiving child support from an ex-spouse or some other circumstance. Yeah, I mean, was there another piece to the comment that?
No, I just think this is one of the issues we face is what benefits do we include, what don't we include? Do we look at true cost? Do we offset true cost with?
Well, in any equation, there's 2 sides to the equation. There's the revenue side and there's the expense side. And so there are policy levers that legislators have available on both sides of that equation. And that's for consideration by the legislature. But I think our job is to really tee up like what we really, what should we be looking for? And then in the recommendations, we're saying, here's a revenue lever you could pull. Here's an expense lever you could pull. Like those are part of the things that we could offer as breadcrumbs to legislature later.
I agree. So Pat, why don't you finish up because we're a tiny bit behind schedule. It'd be great to.
All right, well, we can try and start to breeze along. There is an urban-rural split like we discussed earlier. I just wanted to specifically point out that when we talk about urban in this report, what we're referring to is the Burlington MSA area that includes Chittenden, Franklin, and Grand Isle counties. I know there's been some hemming and hawing in the past about how, are all these counties really urban? It's really sort of a statistical designation from a federal agency that's given. And then the rest of the state is considered rural. We touched on this.
It's crazy.
It is.
So this is the 2020 and 2022 results. This is just looking at the urban basic needs budgets and their corresponding livable wages. These are not the sort of singular published livable wage. You'll see down, I think it's about 3 rows down, yes, the 2 adults, no children. That is what the income is that they need to have to support themselves. And I'll note the wages for the 2 adult households, that's per person. So that's not total household income, that's per person. Except in the instance of the 2 adults, 2 children with only 1 wage earner. That's the income needed for that 1 working member to afford the basic needs. I just want you to look at this far right column, just to sort of see like the magnitude of the numbers there. Because when we go to the rural, you'll actually see that the livable wage or the basic needs and livable wage in rural areas has actually increased quite a bit. this comes back to a couple of things. So overall for both areas, we're looking at inflationary pressures, right? But one thing that we did see in the rural area was a change in methodology. I know Doug just touched on this. So AAA, which is one source where we get sort of per mile driven, the cost per mile driven, they had a slight change in their methodology, which, in the past, the more you drove, the less cost per mile was. But they made an adjustment. I'm just sort of giving a simple explanation of this where, the more you drove, the more sort of aggressive depreciation would be on your vehicle. So what that in a sense did was through a methodology change, if you're just looking at it from a continuity of methodology standpoint, that increased that by a little bit. So there are some differences here that you'll see. I know we're trying to go quickly, but at this point I was going to show that component by component breakdown. So
it's a huge increase. Look at when you go to Elizabeth's question about inflation, it's 18% increase in that rural cost in 2 years.
And then one thing I will say, actually, why don't I pull it up and I'll say it.
So let me just do a time check because there's no reason to rush, except I'm concerned about Tom's time. Tom Cavett, are you there? Are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, good. Are you okay? We're just a little bit behind. Are you okay if we start? Because I'd love to have Patrick finish without rushing. Are you okay if we're a little behind on picking you up at 10:30 and more like 10:40?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay, great. I didn't know what your time constraints were. Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom. So this is coming back to a question from a few minutes ago. It gets at a question from a few minutes ago. This is how all of the different components end up getting stitched together is that large enough? Yes. To come to the sort of top line number that we have. So we start by building these monthly budget amounts that, each of these household configurations are going to need. You'll see just by looking at it, the three sort of major drivers of this budget, as it currently stands, are the food budget, the housing budget, and the transportation budgets.
And this is page 8 of what we have in front. If you want to write down.
This is page 11. So I'm actually looking at the configuration we use for that published family configuration. And in general, you'll see in most instances that urban prices are lower than rural, except in the instance of transportation. If you live in a rural area, it's going to take you longer to get to places, right? But once we get through stitching all of these together, we get to those total expenditures on the things that you're buying, but we have to add in that component of, well, you're earning money, so you're paying taxes, right? So what is the gross pay that you need to have in order to get that net spend amount? And just a little bit below here, we also have that breakdown, sort of how we are putting those tax pieces together. You'll see 3 lines here. There's the child tax credit, which we touched on, the child independent care credit, and then lastly, there was a recent change to the rental rebate reform, and at this point, none of the household configurations have a salary that makes them eligible. But before that, there were a couple of configurations that were eligible, which is why you still see the line item here. As we move forward with the next meetings, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to look at each one of these components and look at how it's calculated to see if we think that the assumptions we're using and the sources we're using are appropriate. So that'll be part of the conversation. Try not to rush, but I'm trying to go fast.
Yeah, don't rush. I think we're okay.
And what was so brilliant about the tax calculation, so Deb Brighton was the one that figured out how to run things back, in essence, backwards through a 1040 tax form to arrive at then, what would you need to get at in order to be able to have the gross income taxes backed out to get to like the, like net you need for paying the bills?
Her sweet spot.
Was her sweet spot.
Yeah, she's
Amazing.
amazing.
So next, I just want to look at a couple of charts. We can, we don't need to linger on these too long. It's really just showing you the change of the livable wage over the last 12 years. And then also we're going to look at what the basic needs budget changed, which is from year to year. So here you'll see the minimum wage has always had, or has for a long time had sort of an automatic escalator. People should turn on. And then, so, it also has this inflationary escalator. Inflation is a very implicit and explicit part of the basic needs budget. So you kind of see that they're more or less moving along in tandem for a long time. Coincidentally, in 2020, we see, both, that's when there's a minimum wage change. There was sort of a step up over and above inflation that was implemented there. And we also see inflation sort of really driving that basic needs figure higher. So that's just, there's sort of a, I don't want to call it convenient, but coincidental in tandem jump up that you're seeing there starting in 2020. And, both figures are well above the federal minimum wage, as you'll see, which has not changed since, further back than 2010, I presume. So here, this is really, so just to explain this graph really quickly, these bars are showing change from the last report, right? So if we're looking at the single person, the net change in the basic needs, their basic needs budget increased by, it looks like about 3.5, 3.8, $3,500 to $3,800 annually. And so really what we're just looking at here is the what components were changing the most for them. The biggest color box you'll see for most of these bars here is for housing, or childcare and transportation. There was this.
Can you just, for those of us who cannot possibly read the font, can you just give us a color code?
Sure.
Purple is housing?
So taxes are in black. Other, which there's a note at the bottom, what that includes is in red. Health and dental insurance is orange. Transportation is blue. Childcare is green. And then housing is yellow and food is purple.
And housing is in the negative? Okay.
Yeah, so in the urban area, for housing, we collect fair market rent data from, it's published by the, by HUD. So they collect this data, and I don't know if there was sort of a market correction or some kind of revision. They actually found that the fair market rent in the Burlington MSA was slightly lower than what had been published in 2020. So, that's coming from that data source, right? When we go to the rural area, though, we'll see here that they actually were calculating some more pronounced increases in cost in that particular component. And again, here, we touched on transportation earlier. That's that blue piece of that chart that you're seeing increase by quite a bit. So that's both, gas prices going up and that change in sort of how much per mile cost was being calculated by the data source.
I'm not sure what we can do about it because it gets so granular. But if you're in a recreation community, if you're in Stowe, Woodstock, any of those communities, real estate prices went through the roof and haven't come down. Yeah. If you're in the Burlington area, it went up faster than traditional, but nowhere near as much as those. So the difference between a recreation community in rural Vermont and the Northeast Kingdom, or in my county, the difference between Stowe and Eden is huge.
Yeah.
So it gets more granular. So more people that are of moderate income in a county like mine have been driven out of Stowe, and no one that is middle income or below can live there. They all have to live and travel now.
Same in Woodstock.
Yeah.
Same in all our gold towns. I mean, the gold towns.
But I mean, that's where when you get into this urban versus rural, it becomes a lot more difficult. And I'm not sure that we're gonna be able to deal with that here because it becomes but it really is a fact that, you know, we saw real estate prices double in my town.
Why did taxes go up so much between 20 and 20?
So taxes go up when your income goes up, right? So as you have to earn more to meet those basic needs, you're paying more in taxes. And you'll see it's most pronounced, well, we can get into a little bit more of that when we get more granular.
Just in a higher bracket, whether you're better off or not.
Right.
That also then must have accounted for that increase in the child tax credit in 2020, wasn't that 2020?
So that would have been accounted for in this report, yes. One thing I will sort of circle back to, the ages of the children are 4 and 6, right? So in the one child household, you know, they're gonna have that for the one child, but in the 2-child household, they're gonna have those increased costs for childcare, food for that second child who is 6 years old, but that child's not eligible for that credit because they're too old. It's 5 and under for that particular credit. So you'll see more pronounced tax increases for those 2-child households.
Right, above 5.
Right.
Ask a question about that. Why was 4 and 6 chosen? Because, and it might just be because I'm in the throes of toddlerhood and my child goes through diapers. Like, where would diapers fall on this? It's absolutely a necessity.
Well, Doug sort of answered that in that one was assumed to be needing childcare.
So that would fall under childcare, like those types of needs?
Yeah, I think that Doug stepped in to answer that because Liz asked that.
And part of the answer that was also given was 4 is preschool, by 6 you're there in school, which has that pronounced difference in who needs to be looking after, not just talking about things like diapers.
And ultimately, it's a methodological choice. You know, like we could have said both kids are under 6, right? But like what's the prevalence in the population? That was part of the calculus. I would say diapers probably falls under personal expenses, but I don't remember exactly.
It's clothing.
Clothing? Diapers is clothing.
I was just looking. Thank you.
Right on the bottom.
Okay, Pat, let's.
We are very close to the end, and I prefaced this at the very beginning that this is probably the most boring slide. This is really just the table of appendix for the report. This is how it's structured. And then again, I've mentioned that Joyce will come and expound on some of these points a little bit later, but in the report, we had requesting the creation of this committee.
Yeah.
And there are also some other specific areas for review that have to do with philosophy, which I think you've already started some of that conversation. Statute, which Damien teed you off for, you know, we're looking at the statute. Is there a way to give explicit direction to meet sort of real day conditions? And the third just has to do with methodology. What are the data choices we're making? What are the assumptions we're making? Are there areas where we can improve that? So I appreciate Tom letting me eat into his time a little bit, but that is all I've got for now.
Thank you. Any questions for Pat before we take a short break? Doug, Aaron, Elizabeth?
I'd like to add a comment to Senator Westman's question or comment briefly. Housing is extremely complicated. We use the fair market rent from HUD, not because it's ideal, but because it's official and is changed and updated every year. We know that more people own than rent, but people at livable wages typically do not own. So to that extent, rent is fair. The problem with ownership is that once you start to throw in property taxes, it would become an immense challenge for JFO to get granular, as you said. So it's a no-win thing. Sorry. Thank you.
Constraints of the data. It's the constraints of the data.
It's the constraints of some of the data that's available to us.
Yeah.
We can just see as we go through this that there are pros and cons to pretty much every single choice that we've made.
Right. So if there aren't any more questions, I would suggest we take a short break. We're quite a bit behind, although not as bad as that time, just having down playing. Oh, yes, it is. Why don't we reconvene, if it's okay with everybody, at 10:45? And is that okay with you, Tom?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. Why don't we shake our legs and stretch our